Balake. Where is Balake at?
My name's Blake.
Do you want to go to war, Balake? I'm for real. Ron.
Hi, everyone. I have a very special guest today, Shelise Ann Sola, who has a YouTube channel called Cults to Consciousness, right?
That's it, Cults to Consciousness.
And Shelise is a former Mormon, born and raised. You know, I actually failed to ask you this in our previous interview. Were you born, like literally born and raised, or were you very young when your family got in?
Literally born and raised from like a long line of Mormons, like the original ones. Yeah.
Wow. So Shelise on her channel talks about growing up in Mormonism, and you've had some fantastic conversations with people who grew up in other similar organizations, Jehovah's Witnesses. You've done former Scientologists, and you and I just recorded a chat about Scientology on your channel, so I wanted to bring you onto my channel and chat about Mormonism.
Let's do it. Thank you so much for having me. Your channel is very inspirational. You have a lot of amazing content, so I am honored to be here.
Well, thank you so much. So let me start out by asking you this. Were you aware of Scientology when you were still in Mormonism?
I think my first exposure to Scientology would have been when I moved to Los Angeles, so not until I was 21. And at that point, I had already left the Mormon church. So, yeah, not really aware of it as an active Mormon.
Okay, because I wanted to ask you, what are some of the things that as a Mormon you thought, oh man, those Scientologists are crazy?
You know what? I can confirm, because I do still have friends who are active Mormons. It's funny having those conversations with them, because one of my good friends, I love her so much, and she's like one of the few that doesn't judge me for being an apostate. She said to me one time, oh my gosh, I just watched the craziest documentary about Scientologists, and oh my gosh, they are wacky. Like, can you believe all the stuff they believe? And I just wanted to be like, yeah, you don't hear it, do you? Because it's like Mormons believe also super crazy stuff, but when you're born and raised in it, you don't think it's crazy. But it's easy for someone to recognize cult in someone else when they don't have to reflect back the same logic to themselves.
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, people who watch my channel have heard a lot of Scientology stories, are more or less familiar with the Scientology belief system. And I think it's probably fair to say that a lot of people who get out of Scientology, it ends up being like Scientology ends up almost creating its own apostates by treating its members so horribly and, forcing family members to disconnect from each other and doing all sorts of weird things. That a lot of the stories of how people got out of Scientology, there's a lot of similarities in those stories. So I want to start out by just asking you, as generally or specifically as you want to discuss it, how did your path out of Mormonism occur?
Yeah, and this is a tricky one for a lot of people. And usually what happens when it comes to Mormonism is you are shaken awake by some sort of traumatic event, or maybe you have a child who comes out as gay, which is looked down upon in the church, and you suddenly have a dramatic perspective shift. And if that doesn't happen, you just coast along, because unless something rocks the boat, why rock it yourself? So for me, it came down to a bishop's interview where, I mean, I don't know how raunchy you want me to get, but I was sitting with my boyfriend and we hadn't even had sex. I was still a virgin at like 19, 20. And I had to go and repent, even though it was his idea. And I was just made to feel like the scum of the earth, and I felt completely worthless. I mean, he literally told me, you are not worthy. You can't go to the temple for this amount of time. It was like a year. You can't go to the temple for a year. You can't take the sacrament for a few weeks, which is like communion. And I was distraught because I was such a valiant Mormon. Like, I lived in Vegas and I wasn't drinking. I never drank alcohol, never smoked weed, never tried tobacco. You can't even have coffee and tea. Wasn't doing any of those. The major rules I was breaking were modesty, because it's Vegas and I'm not going to cover my shoulders and not wear shorts in 130-degree weather. And I had 2 ear piercings. That's looked down upon. Women are only supposed to have 1. And then the sexual sin thing, which is so silly. And so, mind you, this is someone who I was planning on marrying at 19, because that's what you do when you're Mormon, is you get married at 19. And so this whole bishop's interview thing just completely destroyed me. And I thought that I was the worst sinner in the world. And he literally told me I wasn't spiritual enough, that I needed to pray more. Maybe I should look for a new job because I was working on Sundays. Can't work on Sundays. And I was working at the Hard Rock Hotel, which many of you might know. That's where rehab was. It was like this huge televised pool party. And I was a food runner and a lifeguard there. And I was wearing a bikini. Also not okay.
Were you seen on TV in that show?
I don't know, probably in the background. I wasn't one of the characters because I wasn't old enough to be a cocktail waitress, but I was a food runner.
Okay,
so,
but
yeah,
that's not what got you in trouble. It's not like a Mormon saw you on the show and turned you in or something.
Oh, no. So Mormons don't really turn each other in. They just whisper behind your back, and you are expected to turn yourself in. And if you don't, that's even worse. So, yeah, he told me, like, maybe I should look for a new job that doesn't require me to work on Sundays, and I should break up with my boyfriend because I'm a bad influence on him, and all this stuff. It was just like rock bottom for me. And that was my emotional wake up. And that's what got me to finally go to the computer and be like, what is this Mormon thing? Because if it's not true, I'm suffering for no reason. And that was probably the first critical thought I had about Mormonism. And so I probably spent 6 hours straight on the computer all the way through nighttime into the sunrise, printing stuff, highlighting, tabbing. And once I found out all of these crazy things about Mormon history, I was like, oh, it's not true. Huh, yeah, I'm good. Like, I don't have to do this anymore. But it was still a long journey out of the religion after that. I mean, I tried to make it work. I went to the next in line of the bishop. It's like the first counselor. There's a bishop who's in charge of a certain area in the... So, okay, I have to explain all these little things. So there's areas that they have. They break up the map into certain areas, and you can only go to the church that they tell you. You can't just like go to a random church. Everyone has to go to the one they're assigned to based on the location. And then in that it's called a ward. Like, I laugh because it sounds like a psych ward. It's a ward. And then you have a bishop, and he's the guy that's just randomly appointed. He could be your local plumber, dentist, your dad, your friend's dad, just a random dude that they call to this position to lead the congregation. And then he has counselors, like first and second counselor. And those are the ones that are kind of in charge of you. So when you're old enough, which is 18, you're forced to go to the singles ward, where they basically want you to meet and marry each other. So they push you into a church where there's like no adults. It's just a bunch of kids, and they try and like pair you off. That's kind of the goal. So I was in the singles ward at that time, and the bishop obviously had a really bad experience with him. I was like, I'm not going to talk to him because he's awful. And so I went to the first counselor, went to his house. He's a lawyer, super smart guy. Really awesome too with all the youth. And I showed him my binder. I was like, what about this? What about this thing? What about this thing? And we could get into that if you want, but I don't think we want to get too into the weeds of the theology. And all he said, he just smiled and was like, you know what? We don't have all the answers. We just have to have faith. And I was like, this guy knows something, and he's just not saying it, because he's so smart that I just could not believe that he didn't already know all that. And he just didn't want to lie to me, but also didn't, like he didn't want to admit it because maybe he was physically and mentally out and didn't want to lead me astray. I don't know. But I just left being like, well, no one can answer my questions and I'm out. I don't have to do this anymore.
So the things that you were presenting to him, were they mostly things that you found that contradicted other things within Mormonism, or were they just things that you had a problem with? Both.
So let me give you a short list, and then you can tell me if you want me to expand on any of these, because I know your listeners may not be familiar with Mormon doctrine, so let me know if there's anything you want me to expand on. The first thing that I found that I was not okay with was there's this book called the Book of Abraham. Now, the way that Mormonism came about, or came to have the Book of Abraham, was because there was this traveling mummy show through New York where Joseph Smith, the leader and founder and first prophet of the church, lived. He was like, oh, I want to buy a mummy. So he's like, a literal mummy from Egypt.
Okay.
Yes, it's very random. So he pulls out this Egyptian scroll inside the sarcophagus, and he was like, oh, wow, this is Reformed Egyptian, which is not a real thing, by the way. This is Reformed Egyptian, and because I'm a prophet of God, I can translate this. So he, quote, translated it into what is the Book of Abraham. So in the Book of Abraham, it talks about the different levels of heaven that you can go to depending on how good you are. I believe it talks about how Black people were cursed with dark skin and that they were less valiant in the pre-existence, and that's why they were cursed with dark skin. Super racist stuff. I think they go into polygamy. They even go into some like science fiction-y stuff like planets and a planet called Kolob where God lives. Like, actually, I had a whole conversation. I discussed some of this with, I think it was Apostate Alex, and I was like, yeah, we have some science fiction-y stuff too in Mormonism. And so
Wait,
this book,
is that Cola with a K or a C?
Kolob, Kolob.
Oh, Kolob, of course. Okay.
Kolob, that's where God is supposed to live, like physically in a body lives there. And yeah, so anyway, bunch of random stuff. I find out because we have this actual scroll, everyone gets super excited. Oh, we can translate Egyptian now. Let's prove that Joseph Smith was a true prophet, right? Let's prove it. So they get this scroll, give it to Egyptologists or whoever translates, and they're like, no, this is a funerary script. This is nothing, like, he claimed that Abraham, like the literal prophet, wrote that. No, it was a funeral script, like very common. One of the most common things that they would find in sarcophaguses with mummies. So I'm sitting there going, you're telling me that this book that I've been reading as scripture from God, translated by Joseph Smith, was completely made up. 100% fabricated. That's all I need to know, that he just fabricated the rest. Like, I don't even need to know about the Book of Mormon. If he faked this little bit at the end, this little bookend, the rest has got to be made up. Like, how could it not be? So that was one of the main things. Another thing was finding out about his polygamy. I knew that polygamy was a thing. I knew that we didn't do it anymore. I would get annoyed and people would ask me that question, like, how many moms do you have? I'm like, no, that's not us. We don't do that anymore. We stopped 150 years ago, whatever. I didn't really know that fundamentalists were still currently doing that. Like, and they were doing the original teachings of the church, and they were more Mormon than I actually was. But I find out that Joseph Smith had like 34 plus wives, that some of them were mother-daughter combos, some of them were sister combos, some of them were under 14 or 14 years old, and some of them were already married. So he would send away their husbands on a mission to go bring more people into the fold and then marry their wives. And then the guys would come back and he'd be like, nah, bro, she's mine now. Sorry. Like, what?
Wow. So you you spoke to, what was the name of the title of the guy?
The first counselor.
And so did he have a very negative reaction or kind of an understanding, like, because in Scientology, if you question something like that, they're going to come down on you pretty hard. It sounds like he was pretty much trying to be gentle about it.
So here's the thing. Here's how it's a little bit different. I think and you can tell me if this is right, I think in Scientology, everyone is trained to have like the same type of reaction to different things. But when it comes to Mormonism, like I was saying, it's just like a random dude that they appoint to be the leader. So we call it bishop roulette. You might get a bishop that is super progressive and lax on the rules and like, you had sex before you were married, it's fine. You're getting married in 3 months. Like, of course I'll let you get married in the temple. Whereas you could go to another bishop and he would say, you had sex before you were married. I don't care that you're engaged. I don't care that you're getting married in 4 months. I'm taking away your temple recommend and cancel the wedding. Like, your parents, no one can go because you're not worthy to go to the temple. So it really just depends. And that's why, again, I was saying I did not take my questions to the bishop because he's over here telling me that relations with my boyfriend are unnatural and nowhere to be found in the Bible. And I'm the worst person in the world for even thinking of doing that. And I'm like, I'm not going to go to this guy who clearly already has a negative opinion of me. I'm going to go to the one that's fun and cool and is going to actually help me work through this. And so his reaction, the reason I think he already knew all this stuff was because he wasn't shocked at anything that I was bringing up. He would just smile and nod and like, let me talk and let me express my grievances. And then at the end, he was like, you know, we just don't have the answers to all of this stuff. And I wish we did. And we're just supposed to have faith. And so that's why I'm like, he knows. He knows, he just doesn't want to say, because he doesn't want to be responsible for confirming everything that I just found out. Because if it got back, like they might release him, right? Oh, you're helping young single adults leave the ward? Like, what are you doing? So that's my suspicion, but I can't be 100% sure.
Huh. Now, you said Mormons don't really turn each other in, but how was this original conversation that you had with that bishop? How was that something that you said it was your boyfriend's idea? Did he basically encourage you to turn yourself in?
Yeah. So what happens is you aren't required to tell on people. You certainly can. And there is this huge air of judgment, and they call it righteous judgment. When you know someone is not following all of the rules, you can totally like, oh, can you believe that they drank coffee yesterday? Oh, maybe we should tell the bishop. Like, they can do that, but it's not a requirement. And so usually what happens is in Mormonism, it's just like, it's all mental. Like all of the punishments and the abuse, it's all in your head. So that's why on the surface, people look at Mormons and they're like, they're the nicest people. They are just so honest and friendly and sweet, and they will just give and give and give. And yes, of course, that's true. And it doesn't look like it's a harmful cult because everything's happening in their head. Like, they feel completely unworthy. They feel like they're not good enough. They feel like they're not perfect enough. You have to have this perfectionism around you. And I mean, I did an episode with my mom where we just talked about how she had to have the image of a perfect family, even though we weren't perfect and nobody's perfect, but you're expected to have that perfectionism. So when it comes to sinning, sinning in air quotes, I hate that word, you feel compelled to tell because you feel so much shame and guilt for the smallest things. They tell you there's something to repent of every single day, that you need to ask for repentance every single day when you pray at night and in the morning. And so you're trying to make up stuff like, what do I have to repent for today? I don't know. I didn't like her shirt and I didn't compliment her. Maybe I should repent for that. Like the dumbest thing. So when you do an actual sin, like a sexual sin, which by the way, they say sexual sin is a sin next to murder, which is actual intercourse is a sin next to murder. I didn't even have sex, so I was like, I'm fine. But according to the bishop, that was like still just as bad as intercourse. So what happens is when you're in a relationship, usually there's one person who feels more guilty than the other. And he's encouraging me to do these things together, which I wanted to do because, I'm a teenager and in love with him. And then as soon as it's over, oh, you know what? I think we should really repent. We need to go talk to the bishop about this. I'm like, oh my gosh, you've got to be kidding me. You've got to be kidding me. Because I know immediately I'm going to get punished for this. So I should never have agreed to do it in the first place because I don't want the shame and the guilt, which was imminent. It was coming. And also, if you have a partner who goes to the bishop, you're forced to go in because even if you don't want to go and my boyfriend goes in first and says, yeah, I did this thing with Shelise, then the bishop calls you in and knows that you sinned. And then you have to tell the story anyway. So did he turn himself in as well? He turned himself in. Yeah. And the bishop told him to break up with me. And he actually did for a period of time. Wow. I'm not going to lie. Sounds like a loser. It's funny. Like, I never thought in all of my life that I would be telling the story so many times publicly. And I always wonder, like, has he watched any of these interviews? Because, I mean, he's married with kids now, still doing the Mormon thing. Like, it's just so interesting. And I'm curious if he ever catches on to these.
Oh, it must get back to him by now. Would he be shamed for like he's already admitted to this, but is this, I don't know how it works in the Mormon community. Like if someone comes forward to the bishop and tells something like that, something as horrible as what you guys did.
Oh no.
Is it something that becomes commonly known? Does everyone know everyone's business?
Yeah. So there's a public shaming part that is often overlooked or not talked about a whole bunch because you get punished, as in you can't go to the temple, which, by the way, is actually a really big deal because in Mormonism, if you don't go to the temple, you're not going to the highest level of heaven. So that's like an afterlife punishment, which is another reason why you don't want to break the rules, because if you die between now and when you're repenting, who knows where you're going? Like, you want to be sure you get to the highest level, or else what is all of this for? So, yeah, the whole like turning people in, and I think I lost my train of thought. What was your original question?
Does everyone know everyone's business?
Oh, the business. Sorry, the public shaming. Okay, so there's the personal consequences, the feeling bad. And then when you go to church, if you're not allowed to take the sacrament, which is the passed bread, and we don't even get wine, it's water. It's really gross tap water. If you don't get to take that, so the way the church is set up is church, you could probably imagine like church pews where there's benches. So they're not individual chairs. You can't like go in between them. So the guys come through with the tray and they pass it to the first person on the row, and they pass it all the way down and all the way back to the person. So it's obvious when you have to skip yourself and you pass it over to the next person, and everyone goes, oh, what did she do? Yeah. And they don't know. Nobody knows. It could be coffee. It could be you cheated on your husband. It could be you murdered someone. Nobody knows, but they assume the worst. And they usually assume the sex stuff. Oh, another big one is porn. Like, it could have been that. They could have been caught watching it, and oh no, now they're repenting. So that's like the public thing. And then to go a step further is excommunication. So if you do something like, usually cheating on your wife constitutes for an excommunication. And they'll ask the other spouse, like, do you want your husband to be excommunicated for the adultery? And if they say yes, they go up against this big board of people in a room. They have to plead their case. Like, I don't know, either say, I'm innocent, I didn't do it. Or, yeah, sorry, I'm the worst person in the world. I need to repent, whatever. And then they excommunicate you, so you're not technically baptized. Which, again, that's messing with your salvation, because if you die before you can get rebaptized, like, you're screwed. So no one wants to do that. And sometimes they excommunicate people just for random things, or just believing in things, or standing up for something, like women should be treated equally. Well, this girl's being too loud. Let's kick her out before she makes too much noise. And that's another way of public shaming, because you're expected to continue to go to church, but you can't participate. You can't say the prayers. You can't even give your child a baby blessing. You can't, I don't know, hold a calling. So everyone's expected to hold what's called a calling, where you have a job that you have to do and you just do it for free. All those different things are ways that they isolate you and make you feel like crap, so that you repent and come back and don't break the rules again.
So if you get excommunicated, you are expected to still go to church, but you're just not allowed to participate. And most people you can get you can get recommunicated.
You can get reinstated back to the church. And I'm unclear. So if you're a Mormon or ex-Mormon, you know this. I don't know if they have to actually dunk you again, like in the baptism. I don't think so. I think they just like reinstate your membership. But yeah, it's usually a year. Like, that's the minimum punishment out of the church if you've been excommunicated. And for whatever reason, they pick a year. It's messed up, even for teenagers. So if I was caught having sex, I couldn't do temple work for a year. Like, it's a long time.
Oh, so it's automatically a temporary thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So the threat there is, if you die during this period, you're screwed in the afterlife. Pretty
much. And also, as a Mormon, you are taught to believe that going to the temple is literally the most important thing. You have to get there. When you're a kid, they have you singing in primary, I love to see the temple, I know the church. Like, you're wanting to go to the temple, and you don't know what goes on there, but you know you're supposed to go there. and then when you actually get there and you realize you have to wear these like crazy hats and robes and stuff that's like straight up culty and do weird handshakes and chants, then you're going, what religion do I belong to? So that's like where the secret stuff comes in. And once you get there, you don't say anything about it because, number one, you're not allowed to. In one of the temple ceremonies, they cut it out now because obviously people were not okay with it. But up until the 90s, they were doing this thing where you covenanted by this hand motion. Everyone watch the screen now if you're only listening. You have to slit your throat and cut out your bowels if you reveal the secrets of the temple. Like, literally. Like, that's what you are covenanting to God. So when you leave the temple, you can't even say to your spouse, what the hell? I'm supposed to slit my throat and cut out my bowels if I talk about this? Like, you're not even allowed to talk about it with your spouse. So you go to the temple, you learn all this stuff, you're not allowed to talk while you're in there, you'll get shushed or kicked out, and you leave going, what just happened? But you're so invested that you just go with it because your whole life you've been told that that's the goal, is getting to the temple and doing the temple work. So that is held at the highest esteem. That is your ultimate goal. And also, like, getting married there, that's when you pretty much start your covenant. So I never went to the temple because I went as a kid doing baptisms for the dead, which is another super culty thing. Like, no dead person wants to be baptized in Mormon, but don't worry, we got you. So there's that, and then you get your, what they call endowments when you finally get to that point in your life where you're either married or you go on a mission, and then you start doing that for dead people. It's so weird. Like, saying it out loud, Aaron, I'm just like, oh, what?
Well, as a former Scientologist, I got to be careful about saying other things sound absolutely crazy. But, it is incredible. I mean, there is no limit to the kind of stuff you can get human beings to believe. There is absolutely no limit. And Mormonism is huge. David Miscavige, L. Ron Hubbard, Scientology only dreams of being as successful in terms of membership and money as the Mormon Church. And it doesn't seem like crazy beliefs dictate how successful or how big an organization can get. Like, the reason Scientology doesn't grow isn't because they believe in Xenu and the body thetans. Mormonism proves that.
I will say this. Mormonism is a corporation first and a religion second. They figured out sometime in the 50s that they were going to go corporate, and that's why everyone wears suits and ties. They have to be clean shaven. They can't have long hair. Women have to cover their shoulders and their knees. Like, honestly, it looks like they're stuck in the 50s, and probably because their leaders, the people who are currently leading the church, they're in their late 80s. So that's kind of like their generation. Like, they come from that lifestyle. So it's really no surprise that it hasn't evolved much, because the way that it works, like, you don't just get to appoint someone young and peppy like David Miscavige. You have to go down the line. So once you get up into the quorum of the 12 is what they call it, it's like you're in line to become the prophet until the next one dies, and then you move up, and then you move up. So that's why they don't really change in a positive way. But going back to the corporation thing, they have billions. They were caught with their pants down in 2020, I think it was, when a whistleblower exposed just one bank account that had $100 billion in it, just sitting there. Just one bank account. That does not include any of their investment properties. They have property everywhere, temples everywhere. And people, Mormons, will go, oh my gosh, the church is growing. They just announced they're building 10 more temples across the world. It's like, they're not building that because the membership is growing. They're building those because they need more real estate, because they need to get rid of money. They have at least $300 billion. And it's not because they're a religion. It's because they've figured out how to get people to pay 10% of their income. It's a requirement. To go to the temple, you have to pay the church 10% of your income to get a temple recommend to go to the temple. And remember, that's the goal. It's going to the temple. And they even tell poor people, this is so heartbreaking. They go to poor third world countries and they say the reason you're poor is because you're not tithing. And they expect them to pay 10% of the income that they don't even have. Like, these people are going, well, either I feed my family or I pay the church. And you know what the church says? You need to pay the church and God will bless you. People are going hungry. This is not just like the happy-go-lucky church that everyone thinks it is. It's really dark and dirty when you get down into it and you realize what's going on in other places besides Utah.
That's incredible. So you had this this thing that with the bishop where your boyfriend convinced you to turn yourselves in. That you had a bad experience there. Then you went and you did your research and you went and spoke to I keep forgetting the other guy's title. The first counselor. First counselor. You spoke to the first counselor. He didn't resolve your concerns. What did your exit out of Mormonism look like after that?
I just kind of was like, I'm done. On one hand, I'm free to do whatever I want, which was super exciting as a 20-year-old at this point. And I think what really sealed it for me was I took myself out of that environment, and it would just happen to be the perfect timing where I had finished my schooling in Vegas and I did a study abroad in London. And people don't know this, but there's a huge community of Mormons in Vegas because they were the original people to settle it, as far as I'm aware. They just went from Utah. Joseph Smith was like, go out and settle all these places. So that's also why there's a lot of Mormons in Idaho and like the surrounding areas. And then the mafia came into Vegas and took it over. But there's tons of Mormons in Vegas is my point. So all my friends were Mormon. Did I have a single friend who wasn't? I don't know if I did, because my friend group was the people in the singles ward. And so when I moved to London, I was taken out of that environment. I was exploring the world. It was new and exciting, and I didn't have these rules hanging over my head. And I just felt free for the first time, which is also extremely terrifying when you don't know anything different. You go from complete certainty of, if I do this, this, and this, I'll get to heaven. And if I don't, I go to outer darkness, is what they call it. That's like their version of hell. And so when you no longer have those parameters, you're like, wait, do I believe that? Or was that a programmed belief? Do I believe in God anymore? I don't know. And so it's really scary with the uncertainty, but it's also extremely liberating. So as soon as I got back from London, I was there for about 3 months, immediately moved to LA. I tried to go to church because I was like, I don't know anyone, and that's the best way to make friends. But when I sat in those pews and I was listening to that garbage, I was losing my mind, because once you see through it, you can't unsee it. Like, once the goggles are off, you're like, this is batshit crazy, right? And you can't turn it off anymore. And I realized, why am I going to church to find friends who clearly have very different beliefs and who will eventually like have a different lifestyle? Because I no longer wanted to, force myself into the Mormon lifestyle. I wanted to try new things in California. So I realized I just got to figure out how to do this myself. And I didn't know anyone out here. I just kind of inserted myself into my job and working on becoming an actor and just exploring, which was awesome.
Did you have any kind of existential crisis about, well, it's hard for me to put myself into those shoes, because Scientology's most deepest seated beliefs don't include an afterlife, a higher power, a heaven or a hell or a God. And so me kind of no longer believing in Scientology, it didn't result in me having some sort of existential crisis. Not all Scientologists feel the same way, but for me, it wasn't a huge deal. But when I try to put myself into the shoes of someone that believes in an eternal afterlife and that you have to do X, Y, and Z in order to get there, how hard was it to stop believing in that? What happened?
Right. I really latched on to the spiritual stuff because I had always grown up with weird paranormal ghosty experiences, which also the church looks down on. They say, stay away from spirits. Like, don't even watch scary movies because you're inviting the devil in with you and the Holy Ghost will go away. So they scare you into not wanting to dabble in anything else that's spiritual, which is funny because if you know anything about the roots of Mormonism, it is super mystical. Like, this guy was putting his head into a hat with a rock and translating a book this way. Like, he was a treasure digger and he literally said, pay me money and I will show you where the treasure is. Oh no, the treasure's not there. That's because the spirit guardian saw that you weren't worthy and took it away. Like, literally that's the beginning of the church, but somehow the modern day Mormons are not supposed to believe in ghost stories and all of that. Beside the point. I got more into spirituality and I got interested in crystals and kind of like the mystical stuff, but not with any sort of one leader kind of telling me what to believe and how to act. I just thought it was fun and I liked the crystals and they're pretty. So got into that. I got into like, I don't know, are spirit guides real? Let me get some angel cards and like mess with those a little bit. And that was fun for me. And I enjoy like having kind of a mystical view on life without it completely controlling me. And I'm still careful now not to be like, am I in another cult? Like some people say that. You left one cult for another. I think I just have a little bit more of a magical worldview with practicality inserted into that. And I'm just so much happier being able to follow myself, my own intuition, and things that feel right for me instead of having like a leader. But yeah, existential crisis, I just had to figure out what life was about. Like, if I wasn't working toward my place in heaven, what is important to me now? And that's when I really started focusing on me. Like, okay, what if let's just say there isn't an afterlife. How am I going to make this life count? Or what if we have extra lives after this? What if there is reincarnation? I don't know. Whatever I do is kind of led by the decision of, or the influence of, I just want to make the most out of this life. I want to do the least amount of harm to people in my wake. I want to help people. I want to be happy. I want to have a fulfilling life. I want to have children and not raise them in a cult, as we talked about on my episode with you. I just want to be happy. And people look at me now, like Mormons, current Mormons, and think, wow, she is just led by Satan. What an apostate. She thinks she's happy, but she's really not. They tell you that. If you leave, where will you go? They literally have said that. If you leave, where will you go? You won't be happy. Those people out there, outside of us, look at them. They think they're happy. They're not. He cheated on his wife, probably because they left the church. Like, they will do anything to say that the consequences happened because they no longer have the spirit in their lives.
Incredible. A lot of what you're saying is sort of reminding me of the most exposure I've ever had to Mormonism was the TV show with Andrew Garfield. Is it called Under the Banner of Heaven?
Yeah. Brilliant.
Did you watch the whole thing?
So good.
Oh, yes. So, I mean, sorry, I was just about to launch into something, but do you have something else to say about that?
Well, I was going to ask you if you thought it was a pretty good depiction of life in Mormonism, the family dynamics, the social dynamics.
All of it. So accurate. There is a book, Under the Banner of Heaven, which it's based off of. And I read the book before I watched the TV show. And the book was, an investigative journalist. Like, he spent 4 years going to like fundamentalist groups and researching all of it and researching the story that show was based on. True story. Like, that's the blood atonement that I think I mentioned earlier, was like, spill your blood on the ground to make sure they go to heaven, from the second prophet's teachings. So I'm watching that, and I'm watching with my poor fiance who knows way more about Mormonism than he ever thought he would. And every 2 minutes I'm pausing it and I'm like, that line was brilliant because they're talking about this thing in Mormonism that most Mormons don't know. Or I'm pausing it and I'm like, see that sign on the wall? Every Mormon has a sign in their house, like that exact one in their house. It was so good down to the details. I mean, all of the ex-Mormon groups were just popping off with like, oh my gosh, can you believe it? Some people are completely triggered and they're like, I feel like I just went through my faith crisis all over again. It was so accurate. Yeah, it was good.
That's incredible. So, you talk about leaving Mormonism, And in Scientology, one of the things that makes leaving so horrible for people is there can be an enforced disconnection that comes into play, depending on how the person leaves, where all former members, I mean, it happened to me and my wife, you know, when we left Scientology, we were both at the time working for Scientologists. Our kids were going to a Scientology school. Her whole family was Scientologists. Most of the members of my family were Scientologists. And when we were officially declared a suppressive person, is what they call it, you know, we both lost our jobs. Our kids were kicked out of their school. Everyone we knew in our lives who were Scientologists disconnected from us because that's the rules. So how did you, leaving Mormonism, is there anything like that? Because it doesn't sound like there is, which is shocking to me. I assumed that there would be. How does that work when people leave Mormonism?
Yeah, I'm going to say that I was more of a special case because I was already kind of a lone wolf doing my own thing. There is no actual rule that says you have to cut off your family and friends when they leave the church, but it is kind of encouraged. So they're very famous for saying, like, if you see the sheep leaving, just know that you're the true flock of God. And they kind of implant it in the active members' heads that the ones who leave, they should just not associate with them, or else they're also going to lead them astray. So they don't come right out and say, cut off your family and friends, but they use all these stupid parables to make you feel like you have to do that, or else your salvation is on the line. So there are plenty of stories where a child comes to the parent and says, I no longer believe this. And the parent says, you're no longer my child. I'm going to ostracize you. I don't want to see you again. I don't want to talk to you again. You are led astray. And that happens 100%. In my case, I took my questions, my little binder, to my mom and said, Mom, can you help me answer these questions? I found out all this stuff and I'm confused. I didn't know because she was like, I don't know. Let me find out for you. I didn't know that she was working behind the scenes and deconstructing because of the questions that I brought to her. So she was already on the path of leaving, and she went to her bishop and that bishop couldn't answer it. And then from there, they escalate it to the stake president, which is someone who is in charge of multiple churches, like the bishop, but over the entire stake. They couldn't answer it, and they even came to her house in like a really forceful way, and we talk about this in our interview, and they kind of cornered her and were like, why don't you believe this? And you just have to have faith as a child. She's like, I'm not a child. I'm an adult, and I have to talk to my child. My child is the one to ask me these questions. Why can't you give me any answers? And it's because nobody knows, because you don't know the actual history of the church until you leave and you're able to look at the actual resources that are not church approved and realize that they have just been lying to you this whole time. So my mom was deconstructing at the same time. And I always laugh when I tell people this. My mom and my dad called me on the phone and they were like, hey, Shelise, we really need to talk to you. I'm like, yeah, what's up? This is like 6 months after I took my questions to my mom and realized that I was out. Yeah, we just, we want to let you know that we're not going to church anymore, but we love you. And whatever you decide, we will support you. If you want to stay in the church, if you want to get married in the temple, we will do everything it takes to be there. Because if you don't have a temple recommend, you can't even see your own children get married if they get married in the temple. And they were terrified because I was such a, quote, righteous child of the Lord that if I decided to get married, they couldn't come. So they were just like, hey, we support you. And I was like, guys, you're good. I bounced. And they're like, oh, good. We're so glad. So that is not normal. That's not a normal case. I'm extremely lucky because most people get, I guess you would call it, disconnected from their families in a multitude of ways.
Wow. So both of your parents left.
Yeah, they both left at the same time. So I just got really lucky. And some of my siblings were out. So like my immediate family, I don't have anyone super judging me. It's the extended family that are still in Utah and that are still in. They look at me as an apostate. And now, especially with my channel, I'm sure they're just beside themselves that I'm talking about Mormonism in such a horrible way. But I get it because I was one of them. Like I would look at people who spoke out against Mormonism And I would be upset. And I would say, these people don't know the facts. It's just anti-Mormon propaganda. It's clearly Satan trying to bring down the one true religion. They don't know what's really going on. Like I talked to you off camera about the episode on South Park that I watched as an active Mormon. And I was so annoyed. I'm like, none of that even happened. Where are they getting this from? And then when you leave and you do the research, you realize that it's all true and you feel so dumb. You're like, oh, wow, I just didn't know.
So, but even with your channel, your extended family that you're saying is probably beside themselves, they're still allowed to talk to you and see you.
Oh, yeah, but they don't. I mean, my wedding's in 3 days and I have 2 cousins coming from both of my parents' side of the family because they just don't want to associate with you.
But if they did, and I'm asking this just because I sort of want to drive it home to the Scientologists who think the Mormons are, you know, this crazy cult, that if they did see you or talk to you, they wouldn't get punished by the church for it.
No, they wouldn't. So yeah, they wouldn't get in trouble. Well, part of it is because they want to bring you back to the church. So I'm writing a book right now about my life, like a memoir, and my extended family is so terrified about the stuff that I'm going to say that they actually threatened, and I heard this because Utah is so small. One of my friends directly heard it from my aunt saying, when Shalise's book comes out, we are going to sue her for defamation. Once she is bankrupt, we're going to bring her back to the church. Because that makes sense. Like, of course I'm going to want to come back after you do that, because that's what God would do. That's Christ-like. It doesn't make any sense. So they either want to like trick you to coming back, or they want to guilt you into coming back. They want to love bomb you into coming back. So it's not wrong for them to reach out. Because if anyone asks, like, why are you talking to Shelise still? It's, well, because I want to bring her back to the Lord. Like, that's their mentality.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's still better than Scientology. So, like, in Scientology, once you get declared, technically they want to bring you back. But the rule is there's only one person in the entire Scientology management hierarchy. He's called the International Justice Chief. And he's the only person who's allowed to communicate with anyone who's a declared SP. And so even if one of my family members reached out to me and said, oh, I was trying to get him to come back in, they would still get in trouble for it. Because it's like, you're not the one who's allowed to do that. Oh, yeah, they would get in a lot of trouble for that. So, because as you were telling your story, when you say that you put this whole binder of questions together and you brought it to the first counselor and then you brought it to your parents, what's shocking me is that you didn't get reprimanded for even asking such questions, because that's where my Scientology programming goes. Is I would have expected your mom to go, how dare you look this stuff up on the internet? How dare you? But was she already questioning things even before you went to her with those? Yeah.
So the first part of that is some people do have that reaction. And so, again, I feel really lucky that my mom and I are super, super close. So anytime I would come to her with something like a question, or like we often say we teach each other things, and that's just our relationship. So when I came to her with questions, she already respected me as that adult who's very smart and intelligent, and she wanted to know what I had to say. So with open arms, she was like, oh, what did you find? Let me look into this. That's not the case for everybody. And I have heard stories of Mormons, especially like young millennials, who are leaving in droves because the internet, going to their parents saying, Mom, did you know this, 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 and this? And the parents saying, how dare you look at this anti-Mormon propaganda? Like, what are you thinking? Like, of course that's not true, because it speaks badly of the church. It's like, that's what we're taught, is anything that speaks ill of the church or puts them in a bad light can't be true. Like, you have to ignore all of that. And even when you say, no, this is on the church's official website, you just have to look hard enough to find it. People just still don't even want to hear it, because that cognitive dissonance is so strong, and you've put so much time and effort and energy and money into this thing. You don't want to believe that you've been duped, because who wants to admit that?
God, it really is incredible, and so fortunate that your parents were willing to hear those questions from you, and willing to hear them from each other when that time came. Because I remember in the show, in Under the Banner of Heaven, there's a part of the show where he's starting to have questions, and he brings it to his wife, or his wife finds out, and the dynamic that takes place there is it was so emotionally powerful. That show, it felt very much a documentary and not a scripted show.
I can actually add some context to that. Let's say, for example, in that case where the husband decides it's not true anymore, and he goes to his wife, just like he did in the show, I don't believe it. The reason that she was so terrified is because when you get to the temple, you go through a ceremony and you swear fealty and obedience to your husband. Your husband swears fealty and obedience to God. So first of all, hey, a little sexist patriarchal religion. You find out that you can't get to the highest level of heaven, the celestial kingdom, without a worthy priesthood holder. Priesthood holder meaning just you're a guy. You have the priesthood, the power of God. Once you're 12, you're like given this power as a man. You can't go through the veil unless you have a worthy priesthood holder pulling you through it. So in her mind, she's thinking, I need to go to the celestial kingdom. I can't get there if you, my husband, can't pull me through the veil. So I need to find someone who can. And it's really sad. And it happens all the time. People get divorced because one of them doesn't believe anymore, and the other one thinks the only way they can get into heaven is having a worthy partner. So that's why it's so intense, and that's why couples can get divorced over it. And you asked about if my mom was questioning before. She did have some shelf items that we call it shelf items. It's like, I don't really like the polygamy thing. I'll just shelf it. I don't know, the whole like Black people not getting the priesthood until 79. That doesn't sit well with me. It's kind of racist, but I'll just shelf it until eventually the shelf is so heavy it breaks and it collapses. And that's what they call it. Shelf breaking, faith crisis. So she had some few items on her shelf that she was already processing. And then when I brought her these big things, she's like, oh yeah, I don't know. This seems like too much. Like my shelf is loaded to the ceiling. I don't think I can work through all of this and say that I'm a critical thinker and really use my brain to think about all this information. And that's when she decided to leave.
Wow. Do Mormons encourage critical thinking? I mean, is that even a phrase that gets thrown around?
It's so funny you say that, because one of their taglines is search, ponder, and pray. And we laugh because we're like, yeah, search, ponder, and pray with the resources they give you. Like, you're not really allowed to look anywhere else. So it's kind of a moot point. Like, how am I supposed to search, ponder, and pray if you're only giving me the answers? So they say if you have a question, pray about it and receive what they call personal revelation from God. But if your personal revelation from God is an answer that contradicts what the church says, then you just need to go back to God and pray again, because you're clearly not doing it right.
Right. That was a big thing in the show, is personal revelation. And
yeah.
So do you think your mom got your dad out, or vice versa?
That's a really great question. And I haven't asked my dad. We've been kind of estranged for a few years. So I don't know. They've been divorced for a while. I don't know exactly. And I don't know. My dad actually did go on a mission. But he was kind of, if I'm remembering correctly, he was kind of the black sheep of the family already as far as like quote sins. So I don't know if he was ever super invested in the church. I think he did it for my mom because my mom wanted that and needed that. So I'm guessing that when she came to him with this information, he was probably like, oh yeah, let's not go. Like, I don't think it was a big deal to him as much as it was for me and my mom.
So they left the church together, but then subsequently got divorced?
They got divorced later, yeah, unrelated to Mormonism.
Okay. And how many years ago, I've never asked you how old you are. How many years ago was all this? That like you left when you were 19 and 20, about 20 years old you left? How old are you now?
I'm 32 now.
Oh, okay.
So it's been a good amount of time. But I will say, even in those even in those long years being in California, it's still, man, it takes a long time to deprogram from growing up in something like this, where you realize, like, you'll have a thought and you'll be like, oh, that was a Mormon way of thinking of things, or, oh, I'm being really judgy. That's probably because I was taught to judge other people growing up. And like the sexual sin thing, like coming to terms with your own sexuality is so hard for people. And it was hard for me initially because I'm like, am I a whore for like wanting to have sex with my boyfriend? Like a lot of stuff where like, what if it's all true and I'm going to outer darkness? Because here's another way they keep you in. And I wonder if it's the same for you guys. They say that if you know the truth and then you turn your back on it, you're in worse shape than, let's say, a random murderer in prison who's never even heard of Mormonism. So if you know it and you leave, you're screwed. Like, you may as well have never heard of Mormonism in your life, because when you die, those people have a chance to accept the gospel on the other side, but you don't because you made your choices.
Oh, without question. People who get into Scientology and choose to leave are considered much worse than someone who's never gotten in. It would be like we were talking earlier about the Matrix analogy in the chat we did on your channel. It would be like,
yeah,
I forget the guy's name, but you know, the guy who was out of the Matrix, but then turned on all of his buddies to get plugged back into the Matrix because he would rather live that life of ignorance bliss than the suffering and the harsh reality of the real world. And that's how people are looked upon who choose to stop doing Scientology, is they're willingly plugging themselves back into the Matrix.
Wow. That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's wild. I mean, there's so many crossovers, and I think when it boils down to it, it's just the crossovers are the culty things, like the information control, the physical control, keeping people in, keeping them afraid. I think fear is a huge, huge thing to keep people in. Like Mormons say, well, we don't believe in hell. Well, you believe in outer darkness, which they tell you, like, let me paint. Can I just paint a picture for you? Do we have time for me to paint a little picture of my childhood?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
There is this lesson, and I'm putting this in my book because it is just burned into my brain. This is a young women's lesson. So again, when your age is 12 to 18, you are put in what's called young women's, and you are taught to become a wife and a mother and whatever. So you go to these activities on a Wednesday, and the one night that I just cannot forget is we are taken into this room that is, I don't know, it's kind of dull. We're in the church building. They're really boring. Like, they are not beautiful cathedrals like regular Christianity. It's just like they literally put carpet on the walls. It's so dull and boring. So you go into this church building, and in one of the rooms, it's like not decorated very nice. And like, this is the lowest level of heaven, and this is where you go if blah, blah, blah. They take you into the next room, and then it's like full of greenery this time. Like, it's a little bit nicer. Cool, I could hang out in here. This is the second level of heaven, and this is where you'll go. This is where most Mormons will go. The ones that have accepted the truth, but, you know, they sin a little bit. And we're like, all right, I could end up here. Like, this is not bad. And then they take you into another room, which is just full of light. Like, my mom was part of this. She was in charge of helping putting this together. We're bringing lights from home, like lighting up the room with lamps to make it as bright as possible. There's like white rugs everywhere. Like, everything's white and gold. This is the highest level of heaven. This is where only a small percentage of Mormons will go. And me as the A+ student, I'm like, that's where I'm going. You know, like, I'm going to follow the rules, get married in the temple and do the things. So that's where everyone's like, ah, angels singing. And then they take us into this room that is completely blacked out. They black out the windows. They stuff something under the door. So when we're in there, you can't even see the hand in front of your face. Everyone's kind of giggling to make it feel like, oh, this is fun. This is fine. Everyone's fine. But we're all kind of terrified. And then it's this low, scary voice. This is outer darkness. This is where you go if you leave the church and you sin and you become an apostate. And all of us are like, I don't want it. And they're like, imagine this blackness for time and all eternity. And we're like 13 or like 12, 13. Being terrified about the afterlife. Like, we shouldn't be dealing with existential things like that and being completely afraid to just be a teenager. And so that's where we would go. That's where I would go if all of this was real. I would go to outer darkness for time and all eternity.
So if they believe in Satan, how come it's outer darkness and not just hell?
That's such a good question. They kind of view Satan a little bit differently than mainstream Christians, as far as I'm aware. They don't talk about him that much, except for in the pre-existence, there was this war in heaven, and a third of the people of heaven went with Satan because Satan's plan, get this is the bad idea. He wanted a place where everyone can go down, get tested, but they're not really tempted, and they all pass the test and they all get to go back to heaven. That was his idea. Like, let's make it so everyone makes it back. And God was like, that's horrible. We want free will. And Jesus was like, well, what if we send them down, make it super hard, and only some of them make it back? And God's like, yeah, that one. So the people that went with Satan are the ones who are, they never got bodies. So we already passed it. Like, we know we made it to earth, so we chose Jesus's side, like the right side. Meanwhile, Satan's people, spirits, never got bodies because they chose wrong, and now they're around us, tempting us, drink the coffee, all this stuff like that. And they don't really talk about Satan, though. They just talk about his like little demons who are kind of tempting us. And then, of course, like me, I would be led by Satan, but they don't really explain what that means. So I don't really know why there's no actual hell, but they kind of just did away with it.
So what was it like drinking coffee for the first time?
This is funny, and you're going to laugh, and I've been chastised before on other channels, but I actually don't drink coffee still.
I knew
because
it!
I don't like this. I don't like
flavor. I don't like it. I think we talked about this on Andrew Gold's channel, and everyone was like, I liked her until she said that. Or it was someone else, I don't remember. Maybe Apostate Alex. But, yeah.
But have you never tried it, though?
So I have tried it. Okay, let me be completely transparent here. I have never had a full cup of coffee. I have tasted it and been like, I don't want anything to do with this. That's not to say I won't in the future, but also, like, I love my tea. Like, I'm super set with some tea. It just makes me feel warm and fuzzy inside. And another thing that people usually say is, well, you're still Mormon and you haven't shaken it because you don't drink alcohol. Which, surprise, I still don't drink alcohol. And that is another thing. Like, I've tasted it, not really a fan. I've gone 32 years without drinking and I'm fine without it. So, like, I don't really see a reason to. Not to say I won't, but I'm set without it. I would rather do some, like, edible weed gummies or have, like, a gorgeous night with some psilocybin and, like, see different planets and aliens in my higher self. Like, that's a good night to me. But not all the time. I will say you can abuse that, too. That's, like, once a year, maybe. So that's kind of my, I guess you could say, drug of choice. It's the stuff that is more introspective and, like, teaches you lessons instead of drinking alcohol.
Well, there you go. There you go. So now, how long have you had your Cults to Consciousness channel going?
I've been going for 8 months now.
And so I'm not that great at math because I grew up in a cult, but have you been out of Mormonism for about 12 years?
I think that's about right. I haven't done the math either. That sounds about right.
So what motivated you to start your channel as recently as you did?
That's a great question. Well, it actually stemmed from, like, an ayahuasca journey in Peru, but I felt impressed to write a book, the one that I had mentioned. And I realized that if I'm going to write a book about my childhood and about Mormonism, like a third of it is about Mormonism, I need to know what I'm writing about. Like, I need to be well-versed in the actual doctrine. I need to make sure it's well-researched. And so that's when I really started diving into Mormon history and found out way more than I ever knew as an active Mormon. Started listening to ex-Mormon podcasts, John Delina Mormon Stories, which we've done an episode with. He has a wealth of information. Once you watch my channel, guys, go to John Delina. And I actually was brought onto a podcast called Mormons on Mushrooms because I was like, I don't know what you're doing, but it sounds like up my alley. And I was a podcast host with them for about 2 years. And then yeah, they just kind of wanted to go a different direction, I guess. They wanted it to be just them again, two guys. And so they're like, yeah, you're not a co-host anymore, which was devastating and all the things. But I pulled myself up by my bootstraps and started my own because I realized I really enjoyed interviewing people. I loved hearing stories. I loved exposing the cultiness and things and showing people that other people have been through similar experiences and you can relate and you're not alone. So that's why I started it.
That's awesome. Well, I mean, when I found your channel, I was shocked at the production quality. I mean, when I looked down at the subscriber numbers, I'm like, she's got to have 1 million subscribers. And it was like, it was like 10,000. I was like, oh my God, like really the production quality is fantastic, but also just your camera presence. And I didn't know that you'd, were an actor and whatnot. So it makes sense that your camera presence is so good, but your interview skills are great. I've watched a lot of the chats on your channel now. They're fantastic. Even when you go on other people's channels, your skills in what you're doing here are top notch. So,
oh, that's such high praise coming from you. Thank you. I really, really appreciate that. I'm doing my best, and I have to give all the credit for the production value to my fiance, who also has a YouTube channel, Method Box, and he knows the YouTube game, and he taught me how to edit on Premiere and, the lights set up and the mics and everything. So I have to give him all the credit for that. But I really appreciate all of your compliments. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. And so I'll put a link to your channel down below for everyone. It's Cults to Consciousness. And I cannot recommend it highly enough. So thank you. And also we did a chat on Shalise's channel. We just today recorded a chat on her channel. Then we recorded this chat for my channel. We're going to publish these on the same day. We're going to figure all that out. But this has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much, Shelise. I really appreciate you doing this with me.
Thank you. And I look forward to chatting in the future.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much. Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Okay, if you want to see my rock and roll songs, click right on this guitar. And if you want to see a different one of my videos, then you could click right inside here. If you have subscribed or not, subscribe right here. Bye.